They thought he was gone. For a moment that felt like eternity. The monitors slowed, the room went still, and a quiet dread filled the air. A 3-year-old boy, lifeless on the table, no pulse, no breath, just silence. But what no one in that hospital room could have imagined was that while his body lay still, his spirit had already gone somewhere else, somewhere far beyond what we know, somewhere beyond death itself. What he would later describe would shake even the strongest skeptics. But at that moment, no one knew that this little boy, Colton Burpo, had just crossed into the other side and returned with something he wasn't supposed to have: knowledge. Deep, vivid, otherworldly knowledge. Colton had been a happy, active kid, always running around his small Nebraska town, playing with his sister, laughing at silly jokes, and getting into the harmless trouble any 3-year-old would. His father, Todd, was a pastor, his mother, Sonia, a caring and attentive mum. Life was simple and full of faith, but nothing could have prepared them for the medical emergency that would strike out of nowhere. It began with a fever and pain. His parents thought it might be a flu or a stomach bug, but things escalated fast. Too fast. Within hours, Colton was screaming in agony, unable to stand and burning with fever. They rushed him to the local hospital, but even the doctors weren't fully prepared for what they found: a burst appendix. Infection spreading rapidly. Emergency surgery was the only hope. The next hours were a blur of IVs, surgical gowns, and whispered prayers. The family clung to hope, but the truth was clear. They were losing him, and somewhere in that chaos, while the surgeons fought to save his tiny body, Colton slipped away. He flatlined. Time for him stopped, but his experience didn't. Later he would say it wasn't dark, it wasn't cold, it wasn't frightening. In fact, it was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Like waking up in a dream where everything feels more real than real life. And then he saw someone. After the surgery, when Colton finally came to, his parents were just relieved he was alive. But the way he started talking immediately made them pause. This wasn't just a groggy child waking from anesthesia. His eyes were alert, his voice calm, and the things he said? They weren't random. They were impossible. He began describing a man he met, not just any man. He said, "I saw Jesus." Not in a vague Sunday school kind of way. He described his clothes, a bright white robe, a purple sash across his chest, and a face filled with light. Not glowing like a lamp, radiating as if the light was coming from within him. There was no fear in Colton's voice, no confusion, just clarity. He said Jesus came to him gently with kindness, that he wasn't alone. There were angels singing, a city shining in the distance, and colors he had never seen before. Not colors you can name, colors that don't even exist here. He talked about people with wings, flying, about animals that played without fear, about a place where no one cried and no one ever got sick. He said there was no sun, yet everything was bright. He didn't know how long he was there, only that he didn't want to leave. His parents listened in disbelief. Their son was saying things he had never been taught, not just ideas, but specific, visual, emotional experiences. He talked about Jesus' eyes, how they looked right through him, not in judgment, but in love. He said Jesus told him something, that he had to go back, that it wasn't his time, that his father needed him. Colton, barely past toddlerhood, remembered this, and when he said it, it wasn't with drama. It was quiet, matter of fact, but chilling. At first they thought maybe he'd picked this up from Sunday school stories. Maybe he'd dreamed it. Maybe it was the drugs. But then Colton said something that none of them could explain. Something so precise, so accurate, so personal, that they realized this wasn't just a child's imagination. He described being above the hospital. He told them where they were while he was unconscious, what his dad was doing, what his mum said in the hallway, even where they were standing. Things he could not have seen. It was as if he had floated above it all, watching, listening, and then, gone again, into something far greater. And that was just the beginning. What really caught his father's attention wasn't just the mention of Jesus. That alone would have been remarkable. But Colton didn't stop there. One day, completely unprompted, he looked at his dad and said something strange, something that made Todd freeze mid-conversation. "Dad," Colton said, "Jesus has markers." At first, Todd didn't understand. Markers, like the kind you draw with. Was this just another slip into toddler talk? He brushed it off, but Colton wouldn't let it go. Jesus has markers, Dad. That same serious, peaceful tone, over and over again. Finally, Todd decided to press further. Colton, he asked, what do you mean by markers? Where are they? Colton didn't hesitate. He stood up, set down his toys, and pointed directly to the center of his small palms. Here, he said. Then he bent down, touched the tops of his feet, and looked his dad in the eye. And here. That was the moment the room changed. Time seemed to stop. Todd stared, heart pounding. His son had just pointed to the exact places where nails were driven during the crucifixion, places no 3-year-old would ever know to reference in such a literal way. There had been no Sunday school lesson about the specific wounds. No illustrated Bible had shown Jesus' hands and feet pierced with nails, not in their home, not in a way that could explain this. It was too exact, too confident. Todd, a pastor himself, had taught and preached about Jesus' sacrifice for years, but now his son, this child who had barely learned to read, was pointing to the evidence of it, describing something only someone who had seen it could know. It shook him. He and his wife began to realize that whatever Colton experienced, it wasn't just imagination, it was memory. And the implications were impossible to ignore. They asked more questions. Colton answered calmly, always consistently, never changing details, never getting flustered. He described Jesus' eyes as so pretty and kind, and said he saw him smile a lot. He really, really loves kids, Colton said once, almost whispering. And the more he talked, the more clear it became. He hadn't just seen Jesus, he had spent time with him. But just when they thought they had heard the most incredible parts, Colton dropped a revelation that left his mother in tears. It happened on a quiet evening at home. Colton had been playing when he turned to his mom and said casually, "Mommy, I have 2 sisters." Sonia looked at him, puzzled. "No, Colton," she said, smiling. "You just have one. Your sister Cassie." But Colton didn't blink. He looked straight at her and said, "No, I have 2. One of them died in your tummy." The words hit her like a punch. Her breath caught. This wasn't something they had ever told him. Not ever. A few years before Colton was born, Sonia had suffered a miscarriage. The child was too young to survive, and the pain of that loss had been carried quietly, privately, without ever being discussed around Colton. There were no pictures, no keepsakes, not even a name. But now here he was, speaking about her, as if he'd met her. Sonia asked, barely able to speak, "Who told you that?" And Colton answered, "She did. In heaven. She came up to me and wouldn't stop hugging me. She said she was glad to see me and that she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven too." That was when Sonia broke down. Her child, lost and never known in this life, had been waiting for her in the next, and somehow, through a brother she had never met, she had reached out with a message of love and longing. Colton said she didn't have a name. "You didn't name her," he told his mom, "because she died before you could." That was true. They had never picked a name. That detail sealed it. This wasn't a story he could have picked up from anyone. Not a memory passed down. Not a dream built from overheard conversations. This was too real, too tender, too specific. It was the kind of truth that lives deep in a parent's heart, buried under years of silence. And now it was out in the open, brought back by a boy who had died, and returned with secrets that only heaven could have revealed. Colton didn't describe heaven like it was a cartoon or a fairy tale. There were no clouds with harps, no golden gates with someone ticking names off a list. What he described felt deeper, like something ancient that had always existed but we had forgotten. He said the colors were the first thing he noticed. They were so bright, so alive that they didn't even have names. They were more colorful than anything here, he explained. Even the colors we don't have on Earth. Trees weren't just green, they glowed with light. The grass shimmered. The sky wasn't just blue, it radiated a kind of warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He said nothing looked old or broken, nothing faded. Everything was alive with purpose, like the place itself was breathing love. There were animals everywhere, Colton mentioned lions, but not roaring and fierce like you'd expect. He said they were gentle and let him play with them, that nothing was afraid of anything. Birds flew in patterns too perfect for this world, and there were people, lots of them. Everyone looked happy and healthy. Some were wearing brilliant white clothes, others had wings, big and small, depending on who they were. But what surprised Colton most wasn't how things looked, it was how they felt. He said there was no pain, no sadness. No one was ever alone. Everyone just loves each other, he said, and no one ever gets mad. That kind of innocence doesn't come from pretending, it comes from seeing. He described the music too, not just instruments, not just songs, but something different, like the entire place had a melody. He said you could feel the music in your body. It came from the angels, from the light, even from the flowers. It was like everything was singing the same song without saying a word. And he remembered something even more remarkable. Time didn't feel normal. There was no night, just light. But it wasn't the kind of light that hurts your eyes. It was a warm, living light that came from God himself. Colton never once said he felt scared, only peaceful. I didn't want to come back, he admitted. But Jesus said I had to. He said my dad needed me. Then came another moment that defied explanation. One day, Colton told his parents he had met someone else in heaven, a man. He said he looked kind and smiled a lot. He had a hat, glasses, and talked to him like they already knew each other. Colton said he didn't recognize him at first, but later he knew. That was Pop, he said, his great-grandfather. Todd was stunned. Pop had died years before Colton was born. He had never met him, never seen a picture of him in his younger years. But when the family pulled out an old photo, one taken decades ago before Pop had aged and changed, Colton immediately pointed at him. That's him, he said with certainty. That's the man I talked to. He even described details of what Pop used to do, how he laughed, and things no 3-year-old could have known. His parents were stunned. The image of that moment, holding an old photo of a man from long ago and hearing their child speak about him like they had just had lunch together, it was surreal. The connection was undeniable. Pop had lived and died long before Colton's time, but somehow they had met in a place beyond time, where souls don't forget each other. It was another piece of the puzzle, another whisper from heaven telling them this was real. Every time Colton spoke, it wasn't rehearsed. He didn't change his story. He didn't embellish or backtrack. His words were consistent, his emotions calm. He talked about heaven like someone would talk about a vacation they didn't want to end. But for the Burpo family, this wasn't about fantasy. It was about understanding that something bigger, something eternal, had brushed up against their lives through the eyes of a child. And with every story Colton told, it became clearer. He didn't just dream, he remembered. One of the strangest and most haunting things Colton ever said was about time. Not just that time moved differently, but that it almost didn't exist at all. When asked if there was night and day in heaven, he paused, searching for the right words, like he was trying to explain something our language just couldn't capture. It's always bright, he said finally, but not like the sun. It's like God is the light. He wasn't talking about sunlight or moonlight. He meant something else, something living. A light that didn't cast shadows. A brightness that wrapped around you, filled you, made you feel safe. He said you didn't get tired, you didn't get bored, you never had to wait for anything. But at the same time, you weren't rushing anywhere either. It was peace, not just outside, but inside your body, like the feeling of waiting was erased from your soul. He didn't experience time the way we do here. Down here, we're always rushing, always aging, always running out of something. Minutes, hours, chances. But Colton described a place where none of that mattered. Everyone was exactly the age they were supposed to be, and no one got old, no one died, no one forgot. He said everyone looked healthy and happy, glowing almost. Even the older people he saw didn't look old. They looked new, renewed, like their bodies had been made perfect again. And even though he was just a little boy, he understood that this was how things were meant to be all along. No pain, no disease, no aging, just joy. He also talked about the way people moved, how they could travel without walking, how they didn't have to use roads or cars. He said people just kind of went where they needed to go, not teleporting exactly, but as if their heart wanted to be somewhere, and they were suddenly there. No effort, no distance, just presence. He didn't say it in a magical way, he said it like it was normal up there, like it was the default. That's how natural heaven seemed to him, like it wasn't something foreign, but something familiar, like coming home. And then came the part that disturbed his parents the most, not because it was dark or frightening, but because it was urgent. Colton said Jesus told him something, not just a greeting, not just a blessing, a message, a reason. Jesus had looked at him with those kind, endless eyes and said, "You have to go back." Colton didn't want to. He said heaven felt better than anything he'd ever known, but Jesus was clear, he had more to do. "Your dad needs you," Jesus said. That's what stuck with Colton the most, the sense of assignment, of unfinished purpose. After Colton woke up from surgery and began telling these stories, he carried something different inside him. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, but steady, a kind of knowing, like he had been given something and now it was his to carry. His parents noticed how calm he was about death. Not scared, not confused, just sure. He started talking about Jesus more, not as a religious figure, but as someone he knew, someone he'd talked to. That changed everything. Even at such a young age, Colton carried this message like a seed in his chest. This sense that life was bigger than just what we see, that heaven wasn't far away, it was close, real, waiting, and that people needed to know. He didn't say it like a preacher. He said it like someone who had seen something true. The message wasn't complicated, it was simple. Heaven is real. Jesus loves you, and your life has meaning, even when you don't understand why. That was the mission Jesus gave him. Go back, be with your dad, tell people. And so he did. One story, one detail, one impossible truth at a time. Colton's story didn't just touch hearts, it shook people. There was something about the way he spoke that made it impossible to ignore. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to convince anyone. He just told it like it happened, without ego, without hesitation. And that's what made it so haunting. Because if it was real, and every detail pointed to something beyond coincidence, then it meant everything we thought we knew about death, about life, about what comes after, had to be reconsidered. People from all over began to write, to call, to visit. Some came with faith already strong, just needing reassurance. Others came skeptical, unsure, even hostile, but curious. They asked questions. They tried to trip him up, but Colton never wavered. His answers didn't change, no matter how many times he was asked. He never contradicted himself. His words stayed consistent, year after year, and it wasn't just what he said. It was what he couldn't have known. Like the miscarriage his parents never told him about. Like his great-grandfather's face from an old photo he'd never seen. Like details about heaven that lined up eerily with scripture, even though he was too young to have read or understood it. He described the throne of God, the angels, the worship, the way music filled everything. He spoke of the Holy Spirit shooting down power to people on earth. He said he saw Satan, but was not allowed to speak of him in detail. That part he didn't like to talk about. And every time someone tried to dismiss it, to say it was just a child's dream or a hallucination from surgery, they kept running into the same question: how did he know? Doctors tried to explain it as anesthesia or subconscious memories, but none of it held up. Not against the raw emotional weight of what Colton remembered. Not against the very real tears of a mother who had heard her lost child's presence described in perfect detail. Not against a father, a pastor no less, who found himself rethinking everything he had once explained in theory, because now it had touched his own son in real life. Colton wasn't a preacher. He wasn't trying to become famous. He was just a little boy who'd seen too much and had no choice but to speak. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Because years after Colton's experience, people online started noticing something odd. A pattern, a connection. Whispers began about another boy who seemed to be surrounded by mystery. Barron Trump. Now, on the surface, it's easy to dismiss. Barron is just the youngest son of a former president. Quiet, private. A kid in the spotlight who stays far from it. But the internet doesn't forget, and soon, people were digging. What they found was bizarre. Books from the 1800s, old stories that mentioned a boy named Baron Trump going on spiritual journeys, even encountering time travel, hidden knowledge, and otherworldly places. Some thought it was all coincidence, but others began to wonder, why do certain children seem to carry something different? Baron Trump, silent and reserved, rarely seen speaking publicly, has become an icon of speculation. People point to his piercing gaze, his presence, his strange placement in a world of politics and power. Some believe he's just a teenager trying to survive fame, but others aren't so sure. They draw comparisons to Colton, not in the details of their stories, but in the way the world responds to them. Like they were born with something extra, something waiting to be revealed. Is it just a wild theory? Maybe. But Colton's story reminds us that impossible things do happen, that truth can come from the mouths of children, that heaven might not be as far as we think. And if one boy could return from death with a message from Jesus, who's to say another boy, hidden in plain sight, might be holding a message of his own? In the end, Colton's experience asks a simple but terrifying question. What if it's all real? What if heaven isn't a metaphor, but a destination? What if Jesus still speaks to people, especially children, because their hearts are still open enough to hear him? And what if, among us right now, there are others like Colton, quiet, watching, waiting, with something divine just beneath the surface, ready to change everything?